we go. Now it started. Okay, great. So, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Miss Allen. I want to thank Miss Blessing for letting me come in and teach your class this afternoon. So, to begin, I want to just go over what the standards are that we're going to be covering this afternoon. The content standard is from this unit, The Age of Revolutions. Hopefully, by the end of class, you'll be able to describe patterns of change in Africa during the trade in slaves between Africa, Europe, and the Americas from the 17th through 18th century. We're just going to be touching on a little portion of this, but we'll be developing it. Hopefully, you'll be developing it later on with Ms. Blessing in subsequent classes. Hopefully, by the end of the class, you'll be able to recognize that millions of Africans were forcibly removed from 7 regions in different parts of Africa, from northwestern, central, southwestern, and southeastern Africa as captives and forced to endure the conditions of the Middle Passage. Has everybody heard about the Middle Passage in your earlier classes from American history? Yeah. What does it refer to? Go ahead, how do you pronounce Naya?
Naya.
Naya. Pretty good.
Thank you. I took U.S. history last year in 8th grade, and when we did our unit on the Middle Passage, our teacher basically described it as the movement of Africans from their homeland into the Americas and in the islands, and I think even, just that part.
The Caribbean islands, South America, and North America. Great, good, okay. And so we're also going to then look at the relationship between the slave trade and the political and economic expansion of various African coastal and inland states. You've been looking at the inland states of the Ghana, Kingdom of Ghana, Kingdom of Mali, Songhai Kingdom. Those are the inland. And then we're going to see how the introduction of slavery sort of moved commerce south as opposed to the northern African trans-Saharan trade routes of the earlier time period. Okay, in terms of the content standards, or the standards, we're going to try to cite specific textual evidence to support analysis of primary and secondary sources. And we're also going to write, hopefully I won't actually make you do your homework since I'm not your teacher, but maybe Ms. Blessing will want you to do it at the end of class. Normally, I would have you write a paragraph analyzing a statement about the African slave trade that you hopefully will have an opinion about whether it's true or not true. Okay, so let's get into a little bit about about what you've learned so far about the trans-Saharan trade, okay, between the civilizations that you've been studying. Have you talked about the trade routes and what goods have been transferred between the civilizations in Western Africa and Northern Africa? Go ahead, Philip.
I think they traded salt.
Excellent. Okay, excellent, good. And the salt was going to the Western African civilizations, and the gold was going to the northern. Excellent.
They traded iron and rhinoceros horn and they traded a whole bunch of stuff. They traded ore, I think it's called.
Gold, yep. Gold ore.
I also read that in our homework that there was like some trading of food as well, like different fruits and stuff.
Okay, great. Yeah, different
kind of like
different nuts. I think there was a nut that was heavily traded.
There was a middleman, usually between trading, and that sometimes they would try to take advantage.
Okay, during the caravans, they would try to take an extra cut of the percentage of what was being traded. Okay, you mentioned a lot of important goods and services goods that were being traded. Another thing that we don't think about so much when we talk about trade within Africa is the trade in slaves. How many of you are familiar or know about the fact that millions of slaves were actually traded within the continent of Africa? Raise your hand if if you knew that. Does anybody want to take a guess about how many slaves were traded during this West African slave trade? Go ahead.
50 million?
That's a little bit high, but it's a good guess, yeah. So it's more like, it was closer to about between 9 and 10 million, which is still, I mean, that's still a huge amount. During the Middle Passage, the Atlantic slave trade, it's about the same amount. It's about half the amount of time. So the Atlantic slave trade, the Middle Passage was fast and furious, and there were thousands of slaves going out all the time. From the west coast of Africa, there were about 1,000 slaves leaving that particular coast, 1,000 a month. So, and at the height, more than 15,000 a month were going out. Over the entire 1,000-year period that the trade was going on between West Africa and North Africa, it was the same amount of people, but over a longer period of time. Okay. There was a big difference, though, in the type of slavery that was taking place. So when we're talking about slavery that we know about in the Americas, what do you think about? What, if you had to describe what the system of slavery was all about, what are some of the characteristics of slavery in the Americas?
Most were used for plantations.
Okay, great. So it was an agricultural need that people had.
Quite brutal.
Yes. Okay, so harsh, yeah. The people were, the work was physically demanding. They were not treated very well. The food rations were low. What else?
It was based off more skin color than who you actually were or what you actually did in life.
Okay, it was very race-based. It was in the Americas, there was an easy differentiation between African slaves and white Europeans, whereas maybe in North Africa the distinction would be a little bit more difficult.
Identity loss and hard labor.
Okay, excellent. And an important thing, which we just sort of assume, is that there's an ownership aspect. That the people who were slaves were actually considered to be the property of their owners. Okay. Now, within Africa, it was a little bit different. Slavery happened during the later time periods or the later empires. Once Islam had taken a firm root, African slavery followed a lot the Islamic law, and there was a part of Islamic law that allowed and encouraged slaves to buy their own freedom so that they could work off their slavery. Does that sound like a system that you might have heard of already? Excellent. Indentured servitude. So it was a little bit more like indentured servitude. Another main difference, or another big difference, is that in North Africa, the majority of the people, or a large proportion, were women and children. Okay, what do you think the women might have been enslaved for? Childbearing? Any ideas? Not so much childbearing, but close. Have you ever heard of harems? Have you ever heard of harems in the Arab culture? So large groups of women to take care of the men. This is, I'm sure, going to be going over really well downtown. So, and then the children were trained at a young age to work in crafts, in craft industries. Did you learn about the different craft industries that were taking root in the West African civilizations? Okay, not so much. There was gold craftsmanship, and go ahead.
I just had a question. Did you say that North African slave trade followed Islamic code?
That's right. Yeah. So if you look on your packet, so you'll see that these civilizations are trading up toward Egypt and toward Arabia. So we're going up toward the Islamic areas of the world. Those are the territories that had been conquered and Islam had taken hold. And so the Islamic religion formed the basis of the legal framework, and that's what was basically people were following with regard to slavery as well. So does anybody have any questions? about that. So do you have any more? Oh, another thing that was different about the slavery in Africa was that it normally was not hereditary. If you were a slave, your children would then be free. And also the practice that was here in the United States of separating families and perhaps selling children or husbands and wives to different plantations also didn't take place in North Africa. It was the family units stayed together. On the negative side, in Africa, there was sometimes some more brutal practices, such as human sacrifices and castration as part of the harems. There were eunuchs that were sent to monitor the harems. So there was some physical violence that clearly, also they had to travel. You all probably have heard how arduous it was to travel from the Western African areas up through the Sahara Desert. This was a long, hard journey and was very difficult for people who had to make that trek. So it maybe not under the similar conditions, the terrible conditions that we have in the Middle Passage, but still really not an easy route and still being taken away from their homeland. So, however, overall, in general, the situation was probably better in Africa.
In Africa, when you were to do that, instead of Americans taking you, North Africans taking you, how would you be chosen to become slaves?
It depends for what you were being used for. I mean, the women were being chosen for their beauty, okay? The children would go with their mothers. The men were chosen for military service oftentimes, and then they were also sometimes chosen for agriculture, but for military prowess, whereas in going to America, it was more able-bodied. They basically took anybody they could capture, because they needed so many people. But really, the stronger, the better for the American slave trade. Okay, so who can summarize? Who can tell me a couple of differences then that we just talked about between the trans-Saharan slave trade and the Middle Passage and Atlantic slave trade? Can anybody tell me some similarities and differences? Go ahead, Edith.
They were both really harsh and brutal and unfair towards slaves.
Okay, great. Slavery, I think by definition, is a terrible situation. In any situation where one group of people is dominating another group is going to be a terrible system. Anyone else? Number-wise, what are we looking at? Naya?
They're about the same number.
Okay.
At 9 to 10 million slaves, but there was a more selective process in getting slaves than the North African slavery trade. Like, they went for women and children compared to the America slave trade, whereas they were just trying to get
Call it the Atlantic slave trade?
Yeah.
Good. Okay. And also one thing that I forgot to mention is that sometimes in the North African cultures, the slaves were given eventually positions of authority, because they were sometimes brought from outside of the kingdom, and there was a lot of intrigue in the various kingdoms. They were considered sort of someone who could be trusted because they had nothing to gain by telling lies to the king. So sometimes they were considered advisors, or they were able to work their way up to positions of authority. Can you imagine that happening in the United States? No. Women were also taught how to read and write and play music, so they were educated to some degree in some cases, not all, obviously. But certain things that you would never imagine happening in the United States or in South America, where it was just hard agricultural labor that occurred constantly. Okay, good. So I have a reading. You may have read from an excerpt from this author, Equiano, is the name of a slave who wrote about the Middle Passage and his time under slavery in the Americas, and actually in Virginia, I believe. But he wrote about his time as a slave in Africa as well. And so I want to just read a couple pages together. We'll take turns reading, and I want to see if you can pick out examples of differences between the slave systems in Africa and in the United States. Does somebody want to volunteer to start reading? Anyone?
I have a quick question.
Okay.
Can we write on these?
Yeah, absolutely. Divinity?
The interesting narrative of the life of
Olaudah Equiano.
Olaudah Equiano.
Good.
I have already acquainted the reader with the time and place of my birth. My father, besides many slaves, had a numerous family of which 7 lived to grow up, including myself and a sister, who was the only daughter.
What strikes you immediately upon reading that first paragraph? Philip?
When he says of which 7 lives to grow up.
Okay, great. That's the first thing there. This man was born in Nigeria, and sometimes mortality is low, but he's got a family where everybody's thriving. They probably had enough money, enough food to survive. What else, Naya?
They have a family unit. They're all together.
Okay, great. Is there anything else that strikes you? He's an African from Nigeria. Okay, his father had many slaves. His family had many slaves. So already, this is a story. He's known as a writer and someone who is able to describe what it's like being a slave in Americas, but immediately you're struck by the fact that he and his family owned slaves themselves in Africa. Okay, keep going, sorry.
Generally, when the grown people in the neighborhood were gone far in the fields to labor, the children assembled together in some of the neighbors' premises to play. And commonly, some of us used to get up a tree to look out for any assailant or kidnapper that might come upon us, for they sometimes took those opportunities of our parents' absence to attack and carry off as many as they could seize. One day, as I was watching at the top of a tree in our yard, I saw one of those people come onto the yard of our next neighbor, but one, to kidnap, there being many stout young people in it. Immediately on this, I gave the alarm of the road, and he was surrounded by the stoutest of them, who entangled him with cords that he could not escape, till some of the grown people came and secured him. But at last, ere long was it my fate to be thus attacked and to be carried off, when none of the grown people were nigh.
Nigh, what does nigh mean?
Yeah.
Near. Nigh is near. So he's out playing, as any kid might do in the backyard, playing in the trees. What does it indicate to you, their activities in the yard? What do they do when they're outside playing? What do they have to do when they're outside playing? Philip?
Watch for slave catchers.
Okay, and what does that indicate? That it's happening a lot. Okay, and that they're out catching even little kids, which might, for those of us who are accustomed to thinking of African slaves as big, burly men, it might come to a surprise to us that they were after even the little kids, while they're, at any time of the day, and they're being captured by other Africans, which is also important to remember. Somebody like to continue?
One day, when all our people were gone out to their work as usual, and only I and my dear sister were left to mind the house, 2 men and a woman got over our walls, and in a moment seized us both. And without giving us time to cry out or make resistance, they stopped our mouths and ran off with us into the nearest wood. Here they tied our hands and continued to carry us as far as they could, till night came on, when we reached a small house where the robbers halted for refreshment and spent the night. We were then unbound, but were unable to take any food. And being quite overpowered by fatigue and grief, our only relief was some sleep, which allayed our misfortune for a short time. The next morning, we left the house and continued traveling all the day.
Okay, great. Hayden, will you continue?
At length, after many days traveling, during which I had often changed masters, I got into the hands of a chieftain in a very pleasant country. This man had 2 wives and some children, and they all used me extremely well, and did all they could to comfort me, particularly the first wife, who was something like my mother. Although I was a great many days' journey from my father's house, yet these people spoke exactly the same language with us. This first master of mine, as I may call him, was a smith, and my principal employment was working with fellows, which were the same kind as I had seen in my vicinity.
Okay, hold on just a moment there. Does anybody have anything that they want to say about this particular paragraph? Is there something different about the slavery, the activities that as a slave he is having to do?
His master or the person he belonged to wasn't as harsh to him as other people might have been.
Okay, exactly. They're treating him kindly, right? They're bringing him into the family. He's being integrated into the family. The mother's being nice with him, comforting him. It's kind of not what you expect when you think about slavery. What kind of work is he doing? Is he out in the fields?
No.
No. He's doing something that has to do with bellows, which indicates maybe he's doing some kind of metallurgy, working with maybe iron or perhaps with gold. So he's being perhaps trained in this craft. Okay. Anyone, would you like to read?
Okay. Sorry, I lost that.
They were in some respects.
The last sentence.
Right here.
They were in some respects not unlike the slaves here in similar treatment, and when covered over with leather, and in the middle of that leather a stick was fixed, and a person stood up and worked it in the same manner as is done to pump water out of a cask with a hand pump. I believe it was gold he worked, for it was of a lovely bright yellow color, and was worn by the women on their wrists and ankles. So I was there, I suppose, about a month, and they at last used to trust me with a little business in the house. This livery I used in embracing every opportunity to inquire the ways back home, and I also sometimes, for a slave purpose, went with maidens in the coolest evenings to bring pitchers of water from the springs for use in the house.
Okay, excellent. Anything else striking in this particular paragraph? And then Diamond.
They're letting you kind of wander off.
He's certainly not in shackles and chains, right? He's starting to be able to roam a little bit away from the house. He's going off to get some water with the women. What else, Diamond?
He has more freedom.
Yeah, he's absolutely given a little bit more freedom. He's having some a chance to get out and about and have some civil liberties. Did you have something to add to anything?
You kind of said it, but he's working with women. And
Okay.
Kind of something.
Yeah, and actually another thing that's different about slavery in North Africa and as opposed to